This is Dr. J. Val-Addo, a theologian public focusing on the past 500 years of African history on slavery. Welcome to Insights with Dr. Val-Addo. This is a continuation of a question formatted into two based on a claim of a Caucasian professor of history in the U.S. And the twofold question is, was slavery widespread and indigenous in African society before the coming of Europeans? Were there some existing slave markets in Africa that the Europeans simply worked with? We've actually provided a background in part one of this video, and this is the second part. And we provided answers from understanding of the culture or way of life and practices of the Gold Coast and the hinterland as described in English. And we deliberated on three words in English used to describe the practices of the Gold Coast, and that was servants and maids, pawn, and also vassal. Now, we want to draw some conclusions from the previous video, and we're going to provide 8 conclusions. One, that it is disingenuous to use 21st century words and ideas to explain or interpret 15th century cultural practices and social arrangements and practices in our modern world. We need to understand what was actually happening in those centuries and not make it a modern issue to express our ideas. Number 2, the use of the 3 words servant, pawn, and vassal to describe the practices in the culture of the Gold Coast and the hinterland is in accordance with a branch of knowledge that deals with the structure, historical developments, and relationships of language or languages. And we call that philology. Now, it is about linguistics, and linguistics are very important. How language is used in every turn of life, in every timeline of history. The use of the words servants, pawn, and vassal also are in accordance with the laws and principles of the science and art of interpretation and application, including the etymology or roots of words, and we call that study hermeneutics. Now, that means you cannot interpret and apply what was going on in a different period of time without understanding the laws and the principles of interpretation and application. But the use of these words for the practices in Gold Coast in the 14th century when the Europeans came there is in accordance with the laws and principles of interpretation and application. Number 3, they claim that there was an existing market in Africa for slavery and that Europeans simply worked with it, lacked the input of proper Gold Coast culture, practices, linguistics, or use of words, and the science and art of interpretation and application for them in the appropriate historical timeline. Number 4, application or conclusion is that the claim that there was an existing market in Africa for slavery and that Europeans simply worked with it lacked the input of proper logic. In logic and reasoning, there is a law called false clause or fallacy. That means there are certain things that when you reason out, we will find out whether in your reasoning and analysis you are using a false clause. A false clause is a fallacy that occurs or is committed where there are two causes and one mistakes what is not the cause of a given effect for its real cause. What that means is if you give a wrong cause or reason for the actual cause or the actual reasoning, then you are wrong in your reasoning. The second cause is the inference that one event is the cause of another because the first occurs earlier than the second. So what that means, for example, the first cause here is Gold Coast servanthood, porn, and vessel. And the second cause is European slavery. The second cause, which is slavery, should not be used as a mistaken cause of a given effect for the first cause, that is servanthood, porn, and vessel, because they occurred earlier than the second. What that means is what happened that was practiced in Gold Coast as servanthood and maids and porn and vessel occurred first. So when you are reasoning and applying logic, you don't come back to use the second cause of Europeans practicing real slavery and use it to interpret being a servant or pawn or vessel. I hope we understand this, because the first cause were servants, pawns, and vessel. They were not slaves. And so when Europeans came back and practiced slavery, and they want to use slavery with the meaning of slavery in English to replace what had happened before in Gold Coast, that is a fallacy. That is wrong. And that is what I think many people are doing. And it is a fallacy, or it is committing a falsehood in thinking. Number 5, conclusion. And I want to quote Marcus Cicero, who was born in 106 BC and died in 43 BC. He was a Roman scholar, philosopher, lawyer, politician, writer, and speaker. He said, and I quote him, "To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child." Many of us do not know what happened in the culture of the Guinea Coast, in the culture of the Gold Coast. And therefore, if you do not know what actually happened, and he said to be ignorant of what happened before you were born is to remain always a child. And we Africans and people from Africa and of African descent are not children. We should also know what really occurred and not allow Caucasians to tell us what was happening. We must know what actually occurred before we were born. We must know our history. Then conclusion number 6. There is an important African proverb that is worth quoting at this juncture. And I want to quote it, quote, "Until lions have their own historians, tales of hunting will always glorify the hunter." Now, no lion will be a witness to a hunter's story in human society. The hunter will be the only person after hunting in the night to come and tell us what happened in the bush meeting the lions, and the lions will not be witnesses. And so, in most cases, we have Caucasians trying to tell us African history which they do not know. They never validate with authentic records. And so, until Africans as lions have their own historians, the tales of hunting by European historians about Africa will always glorify Caucasians, will glorify them of whatever they are saying. And some of these things are fallacious, they are not true. The seventh conclusion: some non-Africans go to Africa, or they do not even go there, but are fixated on looking for things to confirm their preconceived ideas about the continent and its people. Chinua Achebe, a popular author of the literature book used in many parts of the world called Things Fall Apart. He was from Nigeria in West Africa. He said this, and I quote him: "People go to Africa and confirm what they already have in their heads, and so they fail to see what is there in front of them," unquote. And that is how Caucasians have been handling us. They go to Africa with preconceived ideas about African people, African history, and they only go to find things to confirm their preconceived ideas. Now, finally, the conclusion will be to refute. We have to mount up refutations that there was no widespread and indigenous slavery in African society before the coming of the Europeans. We must refute strongly that there was no existing slave market in Africa, but Europeans strategically and cleverly introduced slavery as a foreign or alien practice in Africa. We must refute that Africans as a whole did not sell Africans and African Americans and African Caribbeans into the slavery of Europeans. And Africans in the Caribbean, and Africans in America, and Africans in diaspora, and indigenous Africa in Africa now, all come from the same stock. We come from the same bloodline, and we should not allow people to divide us, influence us, and divide us. That is wrong. Is to always subject the African and African descent so they can be in power. And so, if we do not refute these things that I've talked about and not take a stand for the 7 conclusions and these ones that I've mentioned, and we remain silent, it will be a way of helping others to continue to destroy Africa and Africans in Africa, Caribbean, America, and other countries of the world. And when we do that, we will be committing the sins of omission, neglecting what we ought to do. The book of Hosea in the Hebrew Scriptures, chapter 4, verse 6, says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." Africa and Africans may be destroyed or continue to be destroyed for lack of knowledge of what actually was happening in Africa in the historical timelines. If these issues raised in this presentation are not properly taken care of and well studied. Now, I've posted another link to a profound presentation by Kojo Mambolo. His voice sounds an African who had lived in the Caribbean, and he did a very long presentation on Africans did not sell you out there. And I will post the link, and I want you to listen to him, and we all agree to it. In closing, if you received this presentation on the WhatsApp, please do us a favor, click the link to the video below it in blue. It will take you to the actual presentation in YouTube. And while there, please press the subscribe button and the notification bell. Give us a thumb up. Click the share symbol to send to others. And leave a comment or a question below in the comment section. God bless, and hope to meet you again in another presentation.